Hello, I am David Bulow, Director of Educational Programs at Proformative, the online community for corporate finance, accounting, treasury, and related professionals. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Reduce the Friction, Learn how to get supply chain and finance on the same page. Why the friction when both finance and the supply chain are interested in having an optimal level of inventory? Does yours work in harmony? Learn how both functions can understand how the other measures and reports inventory and the root of their differences. This webinar will give you insights on how to bridge the gap between the two functions. You will learn how to work together to achieve the same inventory objectives of the company. A few things before we get started. For those who are returning, thank you. For those who are new, welcome. Proformative is the fastest growing online resource for senior level corporate finance, treasury, and accounting professionals. We provide a uniquely valuable online peer network which provides direct subject matter expert advice. We also recently launched our B2B marketplace, which is like Yelp, but for corporate fin products and service you may be using or looking to use. All of this is completely noise-free and without advertisements. Check it out at proformative.com. In order to qualify for CPE, you must also answer all 3 polling questions, and you need to have pre-registered for CPE. If you have any questions around CPE, please contact Chris Bauer at cpe@proformative.com. If you'd like a link to this presentation and a recording of this event, it will be sent out to all attendees within 24 hours. If you'd like the current presentation to follow along, it is already posted on proformative.com/resources for you to download. We encourage you to ask questions by using the question box in the GoToWebinar panel. We will do our best to have them answered. If we do not get to your question, we will forward them to today's speaker so he can follow up with you directly. You will be asked to take a short, less than 1-minute survey at the end of the presentation. Please give us your feedback so we can bring you the best content possible and continually improve. After today's presentation, you'll gain a better understanding of ways in which supply chain and finance views and measure inventory. Do the two functions have an adversary relationship? One, is it appropriate, and one, is it counterproductive? You'll learn how the two functions can better cooperate to optimize inventory. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Mark Gavoor. Mark is the Managing Director at CR Supply Chain Consulting. He has over 32 years of experience in quality and supply chain management in the consumer products, automotive, and defense industries. He has led implementation and optimization of SAP in the supply chain at a number of global companies. Mark's focus is metric-driven, sustainable improvements using sound, lean supply chain principles and process improvement techniques. Mark is an active member of the American Society for Quality Control. He is also on the editorial review board for Quality Progress magazine. Mark has a BS and an MS in mathematics, an MS in operations, and an MA in statistics, and is currently teaching at the College of Lake County in Grayslake, Illinois, and the Keller Graduate School of Management. It's now with great pleasure I turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, David. I appreciate the warm introduction, and I appreciate everything that Proformative has done to set up this webinar and help. The agenda we want to cover today, and first of all, welcome everyone, and I encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we'll try to get to everything that we can, and what we can't, as David pointed out, we will I will respond to them within the next few days after David sends them to me. The agenda today is just looking at the finance and supply chain in general, where they have interest in each other, where they have no interest in each other, where the friction that I refer to in the title comes from, what to do about that friction, and then to look at some specific examples, mostly around inventory, to illustrate some of these points, and then go to a question and answer. When I talk about the supply chain, I talk about this drawing that I made probably in 1993 and has been enhanced to a certain point, but it still stays the same as I've kept it when I first drew it. There's two parts of the supply chain. You have the order taking and fulfillment part of the supply chain, in which the trade or the customers place orders, the order is processed, it goes to the warehouse for distribution, and it goes to the trade. Then you have the manufacturing replenishment part of the supply chain, which is, it starts with manufacturing planning, it goes to purchasing, raw and packaged materials are bought from suppliers, they're transformed into finished goods in manufacturing, and then the inventory is allocated to the various warehouses. These two processes are linked by two things. They're linked by forecasting, going from order processing to manufacturing planning, and they're linked in terms of allocation of the goods, the material flow. If you look at this, the entire top, every arrow that kind of goes from right to left is an information flow. Every arrow that goes from left to right is product flow. When we talk about finance, of course is more complex than what I have here, but in terms of the supply chain, we're interested, and finance is interested in, mostly from a management accounting standpoint, which is planning, directing, controlling, and from a financial reporting standpoint, because the supply chain obviously affects the income statement, the balance sheet, and the statement of cash flows. Finance is interested in the supply chain for one specific reason. There's a lot of money in the supply chain. The supply chain is responsible for the production of all of those physical goods, the movement of all those physical goods, the processing of orders, the fulfillment of orders. So most of the assets of the company are in the supply chain. Most of the people in the company, in the traditional supply chain company, are part of the supply chain. And that means the lion's share of the costs are there. What do these costs include? And some of them are redundant, because cost of goods sold, direct labor, direct materials, manufacturing overhead, you have transportation and distribution costs. Capital budgets certainly are part of all that, and while inventory is part of cost of goods sold, I've listed it separately because it's such an important area. So where does this friction come from? Let's begin exploring that. I have to give you a caveat here. These are my views. I've not conducted a specific statistical survey of this. I am not a sociologist or a industrial anthropologist, so I've not done that kind of study, but this is my opinion mostly. But I think most people can react to this. Supply chain leaders. What makes up a supply chain leader? And I have a military-looking photo here on a slide, as you will see. These are can-do guys, make-it-happen guys. They're hard-charging executives. I had the honor and or misfortune, depending on your point of view. It was more of an honor after, and might have been a misfortune while I was in the middle of it, of working for one particularly effective SOB, and that's a technical term, apologies, that called us men of action. And he really meant that. He wanted us to take control, take the helm, make things happen, make it go. And I think if you find where people in the military academies find jobs in corporate life, probably is disproportionate within the supply chain. So the military photo is kind of apropos, excuse me. So what are the supply chain people charged with? They're charged with making it happen. Oftentimes, we're held responsible for the month end. We're responsible for making the quarter end, and certainly for making the year end. And in order to do this, and inevitably in consumer products companies where I spend a lot of my time, things tend to pile up at quarter end and year end, and I know people can relate to that. We have to battle and overcome obstacles that are inevitable from terms of capacity, transportation resources, forecasts, or actually as we often refer to them, poor forecasts, and product changes upon product changes, which all have to be managed to make up this month-end, quarter-end, and year-end. In our efforts to strive to win, what do? We have to marshal our forces. Again, sticking with this military almost view of things. We have to marshal the forces in our factories. We have to marshal the forces in our distribution centers and with material and service providers. So we're often battling, and as we've seen in the slide here, it's not battling, it's negotiating with suppliers and service providers, and we're often battling with our internal partners. And our internal partners include finance, it includes sales, it includes marketing, it includes engineering, and oftentimes from the supply chain standpoint, these are people that don't understand us or do things to specifically get in our way. And I guess probably supply chain people don't share that often, but that's oftentimes how we feel. Supply chain leaders, therefore, are our most independent lot. Quote unquote, give me my goals, I'll make it happen. And then setting the goals may involve some pushback. And oftentimes we do. But then once the goals are set and agreed upon, it's stay out of my sandbox, let me do my job, pure and simple. Leave me alone, I got the goals, I'm going to make it happen. The quarter end, the year end, all of it will happen. How do we view finance? Well, if you recall, many of the old TV dramas, one-hour dramas about police dramas, in fact, that involved internal affairs. The supply chain kind of views finance often as an internal affairs organization. We know they're necessary, but we don't really want them darkening our doors. Now, let's look at it from the finance standpoint, and I probably know less about this than I think I do, but I'm not afraid to make a presentation about it. Management accounting, this is what we're looking at, planning, directing, controlling. What are the parts that affect the supply chain most? Well, planning is the budgeting. We don't often get direction from supply chain or from the finance people, but we often get policing and controlling when they think something's not quite right or should be better. And these are the areas where we have to focus this relationship and part of the friction that comes from finance. Finance leaders are also quite independent. They take their controlling responsibilities seriously. They have their fiduciary responsibility to do so. They're charged with it, and they're hard-driving people as well. So therefore, they want to get in the supply chain sandbox because it's the big sandbox of money in most companies. They want to stir things around, make sure everything is copacetic, on the up and up, properly budgeted, that the budget is being adhered to, the budget is in control, and if there's any issues, they want to intervene before it gets out of hand. I had the privilege of working for a finance, or working with a finance VP once, and here's how I think he viewed the rest of the organization. He really thought people were not as smart as him or his lieutenants. He also thought that everyone else would be lazy if he did not keep after them. And he also believed, and I think more so in the supply chain than any place else, that everybody was potentially corrupt. They weren't really corrupt, but they were potentially corrupt or corruptible. Now, what does this have to do when it comes to having friction? Well, of course, if one of the two business partners has this view, there's going to be friction. And we did not want him or them in our sandbox at all. And when they did, it wasn't fun. So I turn it back to David for a polling question.
We'll be launching the first polling question here. It should be showing up on your screen shortly. Just a reminder for those in the audience who are after CPE credit, you need to answer all three of the polling questions. This is the first of three. We do encourage everyone to answer these questions as they are statistical in nature, and this provides us with better results. Also, if you have a question, please utilize the question box in the GoToWebinar panel, and we will try to get to your questions in the Q&A session. I'll leave this open for a little bit longer so everyone has a chance to get their answers in. We really appreciate everyone answering as much as you can. Again, if you have any questions, please use the GoToWebinar panel, the question box. I'll now be closing down the polling question. Thank you, and I will turn it back over to Mark.
Okay. The next question in the agenda is, okay, so there's friction, big whoopee. What do we do about this friction? How do we overcome it? How do we manage it better? How do we eliminate it and make the organization more effective? Let me begin with purchasing, or transportation and purchasing in multinational companies. Again, my background is mostly in consumer products goods and international companies. Transportation, let me say, is the second oldest profession in the world. And I often joke, as I will do here, that I believe their first job may have been to move the oldest profession in the world from point A to point B. Actually, I think their probably first transportation job was to move military resources from point A to point B, but that's not as good a story. In one subsidiary in a company I may or may not have worked for, we had a $2 million spend in transportation. We had a manager making about $50,000 managing a $2 million spend. We came to find out at some point that he was getting a $2,000 a month kickback from the #1 sole provider trucking company. $24,000 on a $2 million spend is virtually undetectable if you're just looking at what should transportation cost and look at some benchmarks in different countries and even benchmarks that might be available in the country he was working in. So it was virtually undetectable. We found out because of asking questions and asking other trucking companies, and they said, well, we'll never be able to break into that because of the relationship between the one guy and the trucking company. So we did a little investigation and found out the fellow had a much better house than he should have had and was having expenditures much better than he should have had, and basically he got caught. Do you remember the finance guy that thought he was smarter than everybody else? Well, when this came to his attention, this was such an egregious behavior that he wanted to smash down the walls of the supply chain sandbox and get in there and just mix it up with us. And he wanted to find out, is this a one-off, a tip of the iceberg? See, I told you guys would be potentially corrupt if I wasn't paying attention to this. What are we going to do about it? And what did we do about it? Well, I took it upon myself, and I was just kind of new in the logistics supply chain part of the job, to build an open communication and involvement with finance. And I wanted to do it in all aspects of the business, from capital budgets, and involve them in all bidding and all requests for proposals. I know this might sound like it's something that you do all the time, but I don't think that all companies do this as well as they should all the time. Let's explore this a little bit. Open communication and involvement. Involve finance. They have to be involved. You have to communicate with finance. Friction comes when finance notices variance and asks the questions first. If inventory goes up, if your overtime goes up, and you don't communicate it to finance first and tell them why, and they get wind of it first, they come back to you with kind of a vengeance. Then they act like internal affairs. The other thing that's important with communication with finance is clearly defined and shared KPIs, key performance indicators. Is everything measured the same? And not everything can be measured the same. We'll see when we move into the inventory part of this discussion that it sometimes it cannot be measured the same, but we have to understand the differences and why there are differences. We have to understand how each function measures the supply chain costs. We have to understand the cost drivers, and we have to then provide a basis to compare across divisions and like industries. Certainly ratio measures are a good way of doing that, percent of sales, percent of supply chain costs, and those kinds of things. When it comes to capital projects, whether you're building a new factory or warehouse or refurbing a factory or warehouse, whether you're buying new equipment or machinery, you have to involve finance as much as possible up front. Make sure they are involved and part of the team. Then they understand what the numbers and the rationale for what you're trying to do and what you're trying to propose, and they're more likely to be an ally than an adversary. At another company I may or may not have worked for, there was a CFO that any new warehouse project, and we ended up making, at that company, I think I built 17 warehouses. The warehouses were in such horrible shape. He always measured warehouses in size of football field. He would take whatever the area was in square feet or square meters of a football field and divide it into the proposed warehouse. He goes, this warehouse is 2 football fields. We don't need a warehouse that big. And if that's the first time he's hearing about it and rationale and why, I'd rather have a finance person on my team that's proposing this project defend it than me having to defend it. It's better to have a finance ally to speak to the CFO than just trying to defend it by myself. And when it comes to bidding and requests for proposals, the reason we had that bribery, and there was a few cases of that, is because we had sole decision making. The supply chain, the logistics part of the supply chain was viewed as an afterthought of manufacturing. So if someone wasn't cutting it in the factory, they said, put him in the warehouse until he retires. He's close to retirement, put him in the warehouse. He can't do any damage there. Well, of course he could do damage there, because when he realizes that he's being wastebasketed into a part of the organization that's not desirable, what does he do? He's more likely to be subject to taking kickbacks from unscrupulous suppliers, which seem to populate the transportation world in third world countries. So any bid or RFP of significance must be team-based. This is something we put in place. You have to have a subject matter expert. If you're outsourcing warehouse, you have to have a warehousing expert kind of chairing the team. But you also have to have finance people involved. They can look at the numbers and evaluate things and help evaluate things and represent finance so that you have an ally on the bidding process team and they know at every step what's going on. And you have to have purchasing people involved, because even though we all think we're great negotiators, the purchasing people are the best negotiators usually in the company. I personally will always like to have a purchasing person on the team because I think I've negotiated a good deal and it seems like a fair deal to me. The purchasing guy will turn the thumb screws 2 more turns than I'm usually willing to do and get more money and have the supplier sharpen their pencil a little bit more. And it should be closed bids. It shouldn't be open bids amongst the various companies. You should know who the supplier was. You should be able to look at that and then maybe evaluate them later. I always like to also look at bids where we had maybe 2 rounds. We had X number of people participating, reduce it down to a vital 2 or 3, and then ask them to sharpen their pencils. Even if you're trying to get rid of the incumbent, you want to keep them in the bid because you want them to think they're going to retain the business so they don't provide even worse service in the bidding process time. And of course, you want always some new suppliers or service providers involved. No sole decision making and a cross-functional team to do the bidding. Finance relationship building with the supply chain. If the supply chain is the most important part or one of the most important parts of the cost structure of the company and a productive part of driving the revenue part of the company, why is there not a finance person matrixed into the supply chain organization? This person should assist the supply chain leader in all finance and accounting matters, and that person should be part of the supply chain leadership team. That person, the finance person in the supply chain, should not be assigned. It works better when a supply chain leader has a say in who takes that job. In other words, he should be interviewing the various candidates that the finance people are putting forward. Placement then should be a joint supply chain and finance decision and announcement. In other words, both the finance head and a supply chain head should be signing the announcement that, you know, Tom Smith or Susan Kelly is now the supply chain finance manager or director. It sounds ridiculously fundamental, but I think it's surprisingly missing in many organizations, and I see it more in my consulting work than I actually did in the corporate life. So reducing friction. There's surprisingly similar actions no matter what the functions are. It could be sales and supply chain. It could be sales and finance. What are we suggesting? Involve and communicate. Build trust. Build a team. And when you do that, what happens? You get better results. So what do both finance and supply chain want? They want better results. What are better results? They want a supply chain that has the right goods in the right place at the right time in the right quantities to support sales with perfect quality at the lowest possible cost. So we want that. We want the right goods, right place, right time, in the right quantities. And when you have it at the lowest possible cost, you yield the best revenues because that's where all the right product in the right place, right time, and profits for the company because you're not shortcutting customer service at all. This is better achieved by building trust and teamwork than fighting. It's always the case, but not always easily seen and easily gotten to. So let's transition and look at some specific inventory examples, perhaps to illustrate these points a little bit more. Inventory can and often is a huge issue. As we've gone from mostly a domestic supply chain to international supply chains, inventory is cash, and we have cash all over the company tied up in terms of inventory in various warehouses and distribution centers. Supply chain measures and deals with cases. We deal with what the finance people call perpetual inventory. We're managing it daily. We're managing it hourly. We're managing it almost by the minute. And when we talk about cases, it could be pallets, it could be tons, it could be layers, it could be any measure. But we deal with the physical, not so much the financial on a day-to-day basis. Finance is interested in inventory from a dollar standpoint. And mostly they're looking at it in what accounting people call periodic, usually the end of the month, the end of the quarter, and definitely the end of the year. When they take this periodic snapshot, many companies have adjustments and accruals that are involved in the final calculation of what that periodic inventory that is reported should be, and that often involves things that the supply chain cannot adjust, cannot control, but has to live with the final number that comes out. Also, finance is interested if it's FIFO or LIFO, and sometimes once in a blue moon they may change from one to the other. Luckily, that does not happen often, and it really does not affect the way the supply chain looks at inventory. It is the way finance looks at inventory. So if there's inflation or price increases, it changes the finance number more than it would change a supply chain view of how many actual physical units and items are in inventory. So both finance and supply chain numbers will move in tandem. In other words, if the supply chain does some wonderful work, does some leaning out of the factories and leaning of the warehouses, and improves forecasting through sales and operations planning, and brings the inventory number down, the finance number will come down as well. They move in tandem. If we make a wrong move and purchase too much of something, or sales don't come to fruition as we planned and bought for and produced to, the supply chain inventory number will go up, the finance inventory number will go up, but oftentimes it will be different. And everyone needs to understand why, and they need to understand what can the supply chain control and what can't they control. What is in, and this is sometimes where friction comes, because the supply chain gets beaten down maybe in a general management meeting by finance, reduce this, reduce that, and part of it cannot be controlled. And the part that gives me the most headache and heartache through my entire career is something called excess and obsolete inventory. The company that I worked for initially, where I learned this concept, they used to call it slow and obsolete inventory, and it was slob. I like that better than E&O, and I'll always call it slob because that's exactly what it is. It's a mess. It's stuff that's left over. It's stuff that you can't do anything about. When we talk about slow, it's over N months coverage in terms of days. And usually I've seen it be either 3 or 4 months seems to be the magic number for there. So if you have more than 3 months coverage in a particular item, you would call that a slow-moving item. Obsolete, on the other hand, is some product that's no longer sold or is, for some reason, unsaleable. If it's no longer sold, it might be a saleable good, but just sales and marketing have no interest in selling it. I don't know if anyone notices this, but sales and marketing seem to have no rear view mirrors in their car. They don't see what they've left behind. They only look forward to the new and exciting products and promotions that they have to sell. An unsaleable item could be something that is prohibited from a quality standpoint from selling because it's out of date and cannot be sold. It could be a licensing agreement with a company like Disney that maybe you bought too many widgets that were logoed with a particular Disney character that for the launch of a movie, and after the movie is out of the theaters, you're prohibited by contract from selling them. That would be an unsaleable good. So slow and obsolete is an issue. Let's look at it a little bit. What % of your inventory is slob, slow and obsolete? This is the hardest inventory ever to reduce. How much productive warehouse space is lost to slob? How many of your warehousing slots or your pallet positions or your tonnage is taken up by slob? You might as well fill those pallet positions, those storage locations with cinder blocks. You might as well cement them in. You have a warehouse, if you have 25% slob, which is not unheard of, you have a productive warehouse that's 25% less productive. And worst case, if you're renting outside space just to house it, what a waste of money that is. And the supply chain will get beaten up for having to do that. Slob is almost always the responsibility of the supply chain. I would like to see a company where it put it in the hands of sales or marketing. Never the case that I have seen. Often nothing the supply chain can do to reduce it either. Minimally, if it can be reworked, they have more leeway there. The supply chain has more leeway if the product can be reworked. So what can a supply chain do? Pile it up nice and high, count it, and dust it off once in a while. Anything else requires the cooperation of other functions. Rework. We need finance to agree to the margin hit. We can't just rework and add value to product and then sell it because it will affect the margin. We could do it, but if the margin goes down, finance will want to know why. It's better to get their approval up front. Need sales to actually sell obsolete or slow-moving product. Finance and supply chain together have more leverage over the sales people than the supply chain alone. In fact, that's when we kind of appreciate when finance gets a little bit of controlling and directing and policing and acts like internal affairs. It's like, sales guys, you got this pile of stuff in the warehouse. When are you going to get rid of it? The supply chain can't get rid of it. That's really supply chain and finance partnering that I kind of like to see. And then the worst case is if the product needs to be written off or sold at a major loss. No one ever wants to do this. The general manager doesn't want to do this. The finance guy doesn't want to do it. You could have a policy that says every 90 days, once a quarter, you have to have a resolution of slow and obsolete inventory and write it off. People still won't do it because no one wants to take the hit on the P&L. But eventually, things have to be written off, and usually it's when a general manager changes and he comes in and says, look at this pile of stuff I've inherited. I'm not taking a job unless we can write it all off. They write it all off. He starts from zero and builds up his slow and obsolete inventory until he leaves, and the next guy comes in and does the same thing. The supply chain basically can't do anything about it. They need a finance ally here. And then let's look at pressuring the supply chain to reduce inventory. Here's an example. Here's the average inventory, millions of dollars, and this is actually a real example. It's been modified a little bit, just standardized, if you will. In materials and finished goods, in active materials and finished goods, there's $50 million of inventory, $1 billion in sales in this company, and the E&O is $30 million for a total of $80 million of inventory. The COGS are 36%, so that makes it $360 million of COGS. On the productive inventory, it ends up being 7.2 turns, and on the total, it ends up being 4.5 turns. So you got 4.5 turns if you look at inventory is $80 million, 7.2 if you look at it is 50, and so what do you have with this excess and obsolete or this slop? You have a negative 2.7 turns that's draining your system. It's cholesterol in the supply chain. It's clogging up the supply chain arteries. Now, this was a state in a particular company. If we go one step further, the CEO said, okay, I want to get to 10 turns. I want a plan to get to 10 turns. Well, do we have a plan to get to 10 turns reducing slob or not? If we don't reduce slob, to get to 10 turns, we have to take the productive inventory down to $6 million. That ends up being 60 turns. The E&O stays the same at 30. That becomes an anchor of minus 50 turns, so you get to a total of 10 turns. That is impossible to do unless you're going to reduce some of the E&O, and the junk that this company had, it had to be written off. It could not be used for anything. It was completely obsolete, unsaleable goods. The only value it had was scrap. This was eye-opening, and this is something that the supply chain needs to be able to put in front of finance and a leadership to understand what they're asking for in terms of inventory management. Turns or days coverage. This is an argument that happens in many companies. Well, both are important. They're reciprocals of each other, of course. We need to remind people how they are calculated. And I will add that you need to remind people way more than you think they need reminding how they're calculated. Because people use the terms and don't fully understand what they mean. The COO or CEO usually like to see one or the other for reporting and objectives. I want the reporting set in terms of days coverage, or I want the reporting set in terms of turns. And here's where I want the objective to be. Okay, they want it. Therefore, provide it. But always dollarize the baseline and where the objective will be, and state it with slob and state it without slob, as the previous two slides showed, because that way you can see what kind of money we're talking about when we do this.
Thank you, Mark. We will now be bringing up the second of 3 polling questions. Should be showing up on your screen here just shortly. I want to remind everyone that we will be having a short survey at the end of the presentation. Please give us this time to help us improve and continue to give you the best content possible. And if you do have any questions for Mark, please use the question box in your GoToWebinar panel, and we will try to have these answered at the end during our question and answer session. We do ask everyone to answer all the polling questions because they're statistical in nature, and this helps give us better results. I'll hold it open just for a little bit longer so everyone can get their answers in. And I'll be give it about another 5 seconds here before I close it down. Okay, I'll be closing it down, and we'll turn this back over to Mark.
Okay. One question that I asked, especially since inventory turns are used a lot in companies. I want to go from 5 turns to 7 turns. I want to go from 7 turns to 10. I want to go from 15 to 20. Whatever the case may be, I asked the question once, how much is an inventory turn worth? And who did I ask the question of? I asked the question of finance people, because I figured these are the guys. They're accounting whizzes. They're geniuses. I had great respect for them, a little bit of fear for them, and plus I wanted to see if they knew. I didn't know. I thought they might know. They were not able to answer the question. They were not able to answer the question. So I took the bull by the horns, and I actually have done some work in how much is an inventory turn worth. So let's stick with our current example. If the current inventory is $50 million and the current inventory turns is 1, you increase the turns by 1, your savings in terms of inventory is going to be $25 million. If at $50 million your current inventory turns are 2, and you go to 3 turns, the inventory turn is worth $16.7 million. And you can see as the current, if you take it up to 15 turns and you go to 16 turns, the inventory turns therefore are only worth, the next inventory turn is only worth $3.1 million in inventory reduction. So it really depends on, when you're talking about turns, how many turns you have and what the next turn is. Let's look at another way of illustrating the same point. Let's start with our same $50 million of inventory, and let's say the turns are currently 6. To go to 7, you have to take out $7.1 million. To go from 7 to 8, then you're starting at the baseline of 42.9 then. To go from 7 to 8, you have to reduce another $5.4 million. To go from 8 to 9, $4.2 million, and so on. Finally, when you get to $20 million in inventory and it's 15 turns, to go to 16, you have to take $1.3 million out to get to $18.8 million in inventory. So if you look at the inventory graph, it is the reciprocal of days coverage, as we said. So the reciprocal of X, 1 over X, tends to look like this, and I'm showing off my math degree here, I apologize, is hyperbola, much like the 1 over, Y equals 1 over X kind of graph that you see here. So turns are diminishing returns or savings in inventory as your turns go up. You take less and less out. I think that many people, including finance, believe it's linear. It is not. And I think it's worth having that discussion with finance and making sure the objectives are clear so that they're clearly communicated to the C-level, either operations officer or executive officer. So let's look at, in summary, what we've done. The easiest thing in the world is to have friction between finance and the supply chain. Why is that? We have dynamic leaders in both. They both want to make things happen. They both are hard-charging kind of guys, independent, and they can butt heads very easily between the two organizations. This does not have to be, and the prescription is open communication and teamwork, capital projects, looking at the capital projects together, involving finance in both capital projects and all bidding and all requests for proposals, development and evaluations. You need a finance person on the supply chain leadership team. And then usually people will ask, well, where do we start this happier relationship? Oftentimes, if there's an adversarial relationship between finance and supply chain, and finance is all over supply chain, at least in my background, it's been mostly over inventory, and mostly because if you have your inventory is out of whack, that means your customer service is out of whack, so you're affecting revenues as well. That is a great place to start. That is the perfect battleground where you can marshal both functions, resources together to solve a problem for the entire company. And that's where I think one ought to begin. So I would like to thank all of you for your attention today, and David and the Proformative staff for all the work that they did in help setting this up together. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dave for the next portion of this program.
We appreciate that. And now we would like to show the results of our first polling questions. They should be coming up on your screen here just shortly. Here they are. And comments on this, Mark?
Yeah, I was not sure what to expect. And, you know, it really depends probably on the mix of the companies. But if you look at adversarial at 16%, well, certainly those companies can work harder. But if we look at neutral and adversarial together, that's 66% of the companies are not using the two functions in a teamwork format. Probably the 34% that are probably getting even better results from their supply chain than the 66% that are looking at it as either neutral or adversarial. I wasn't sure exactly what to see here, and I was a little surprised to see neutral at 50%. That would be my view of just looking at this cursory. I like to almost see the companies involved and look at their financials a little bit, look at the inventory turns of the companies and see how it was in the adversarial companies, how it was in the neutral companies, and the companies where it's a team.
Okay, and we will now show the results of the second polling question. Should be appearing here just shortly before we moved into the Q&A.
All right, well, this is no surprise. Everybody should be looking at dollars for the most part. And then you see the next one is turns and dollars. I don't know, C-level guys love turns. I don't know why that is. Some like days coverage, but turns and dollars is what you have to look at. So if we look at dollars and turns and dollars, that's probably 67%. Two-thirds of the people look at it that way. This is not so surprising to me. But people that only look at turns and only look at days coverage, I would suggest to companies like that to move down to turns and dollars and days coverage in dollars. I think so people understand how many dollars are involved and where those dollars are coming from. Because in the example that I used, if you have a high level of slob and you want to take your turns up to a certain level but aren't allowed to touch the slob, you want to make sure that everybody understands what's being asked of you out of the productive inventory of the company. You will take down your supply chain capability if you try to achieve based on that real-life example that I showed you. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. We will now move into the Q&A portion. And for the first question, Mark, from the audience, are you suggesting that finance downplay their fiduciary responsibility to control activities in the supply chain and focus instead on team building?
No, I'm not. And if I gave that impression, that's not what I meant to do. That's a major role of the finance organization, that internal affairs, that policing, that fiduciary responsibility. They cannot give that up because they're responsible. They're the police force inside the company from the shareholder standpoint to make sure things are done properly and according to good accounting principles, and they can't ever give that up. But they shouldn't be carrying that club all the time. They need to know when to use it. Much like most management styles and techniques, if you only have one tool and that tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Well, every problem doesn't require the hammer all the time, and maybe there's something to be gained through cooperation, teamwork, and team building. So I'm suggesting finance perhaps err first on the side of team building, but then if they have evidence or suspicion that something may not be quite right, then they roll back or roll into the internal affairs kind of policing role. So I don't mean that they should give that up at all, no.
Next question is, it seems like the don't play in my sandbox attitude from the supply chain leader sets the tone for the relationship. What do you think?
Well, I think it's 50-50, but definitely if you have an agreeable finance guy and you got a one hard-nosed supply chain, don't play in my sandbox guy running the supply chain, that will set the tone. Oftentimes it's a little bit 50-50. and how that goes. So I agree, and that's both functions have to change. That's the thing about teamwork, is both team members have to meet halfway on it.
Great. Also, if everyone has their objectives and goals, should they be held responsible for achieving them and getting along secondary?
Well, yes, everybody has to achieve their goals, but you know, I remember cutting my teeth in the auto industry when we were being beat up in the United States by Japanese, in particular, automakers in those days with superior quality. And a lot of people in the U.S. auto industry just simply said, if everybody just did their job, we wouldn't have any quality problems. Easiest thing in the world to say. But it was way more complex than that, and it required a lot more cross-functional cooperation. You had to engineer the products right, you had to manufacture the products properly, you had to make sure that the suppliers were involved and were carrying their end of things. So it's not just everybody doing their job properly. You do objective setting, but then you have to negotiate with different functions to make sure that things work. So yes, everybody should do their job, but there's nothing wrong with saying, listen, I've got this objective, you have some say in it. If I'm supposed to reduce slow and obsolete inventory, I need sales to help me do it, because I'm not going to, as a supply chain leader, I cannot sell the stuff. I need finance to help me. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I want to thank you for those insights and discussion. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions today, but we will work with Mark to get them answered for you directly after the webinar. Just the last few housekeeping items before we end the webinar today, at which time you'll be prompted to participate in a short survey. We truly value your feedback and appreciate your time to help us continue to deliver great content. At that time, you can easily request to connect with Mark through a click of your mouse. Please join us on Proformative.com to continue this great discussion. I also want to remind everyone that we will be holding our CFO Dimension Conference on August 21st and 22nd in New York, and I'd like to personally invite you to this premier event. As a special thank you for attending today's webinar, I'll be sending you each out a discount off the early bird pricing for you that register by June 30th. And now I'll launch the third of 3 polling questions. Be appearing here just shortly on your screen. You should be seeing it here just shortly. I would like to take this time to thank you, the audience, for your time. Again, after we close down the webinar, you'll be prompted to take a short survey. If we could please ask you to participate so that we may get better, deliver the right type of content and webinar to you, we'd greatly appreciate it. Also, there you'll have an opportunity to request a connection with our speaker or request more information on CFO Dimensions with a click of your mouse. I want to thank Mark for his insights, his great presentation today, and I want to thank you. We hope we see you on another Proformative event or online at Proformative.com. I'll now be closing the polling question, and this will conclude our webinar. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you, and goodbye.